Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the fish and wildlife management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gherkin. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and we're going to talk about some food plots today, Drew, for deer, I'm guessing.
Yeah. So, it's early October. It's a little late in a lot of people's mind to be thinking about food plots, but it's actually not too late to be thinking about hunting plots, especially for white-tailed deer in the Central Great Plains, and especially if you're not necessarily an early season archery hunter. It's a couple of weeks you can have plenty of food out there if you've got good soil moisture and it hadn't gotten too cold yet. I wanted to discuss, especially thinking about food plots as hunting plots, because that's really the main purpose of a food plot for white-tailed deer in the Great Plains when we think about it. So,
is there a difference? Does it matter, or is it just what we're calling them?
Well, it doesn't matter. It's just what we're calling them. But from when we look at the research around providing food for wildlife, and especially providing food for white-tailed deer, a lot of the research that supports food plantings for deer from a carrying capacity standpoint, or from an increasing carrying capacity standpoint, it comes from South Texas or the southeastern United States. And a lot of times we talk about wildlife in general, right? We think about, well, a deer's a deer, wherever it is, and something that's good for deer in Mississippi, well, it's going to be good for deer in Kansas too, right? But that's not always the case. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. We spend a lot of time focusing on managing natural habitat rather than plantings, at least on this podcast. And so we haven't really done an episode on food plots for deer, and I wanted to talk about that.
Well, maybe give us an overview on what the difference is between a deer forage opportunity in Mississippi compared to Kansas.
Sure. So, there's lots of different things that go into what limiting factors are for critters, right? And so when we think about habitat, generally it's the components of habitat are that food, cover, water, and space. If you're in really arid areas, then oftentimes water might be the limiting factor, right? If we are in a place where we've got a critter like white-tailed deer and it's mostly prairie and there's not a lot of trees, not a lot of tall corn, not a lot of topography in ravines and those sorts of things, then cover might be the limiting factor. If there's not enough food for the individuals that are there, then food's a limiting factor, right? And we tend to think about, and I'm dancing around your question, I think, but especially in livestock heavy areas like Kansas where we live, and the Great Plains in general, we think about producing wildlife in a lot of the same ways that we think about producing livestock, right? So with livestock, space is our main limiting factor, and we can add food and water and cover pretty easily, right? But we might have a fairly confined space that we're trying to raise those critters in. And so because of that, then naturally we think of, let's add food and some water, and we're gonna be able to produce more critters in the same amount of space. That only works if food is a limiting factor in that setting, right? So going back to what's the difference between foraging opportunities in Mississippi versus Kansas and those sorts of things, I haven't studied deer in Mississippi, right? So I'm probably going to miss some stuff. But the things that go into what's driving how much food is available on the landscape for a critter, and how much food is available within a reasonable home range for that critter is really what we need to think about if we're trying to increase carrying capacity. Density of the critter we're thinking about is something that really drives that, right? We've got in Kansas, Wildlife and Parks is at least working on increasing opportunities to take antlerless deer. But, in Kansas, the most antlerless deer tags that you can get in an area would be 6 for a unit, and that's the areas where we have the highest deer densities. And there are parts of the Southeast, I'm not sure what Mississippi's specific regulations are, but there are parts of the Southeast where you can take a certain number of deer per day.
Oh, wow.
It's not you get 5 tags for the whole season or 6 or 7 tags for the whole season. It's you can kill this many antlerless deer per day throughout the entire season. Okay, and those regulations allude to the fact that deer densities might be too high for the natural vegetation that's produced there.
Sure.
So deer density is an important thing to think about. Other things to think about are things like soil quality. And for years and years, we've talked about soil quality and the effects of that on nutrients in plants. And some really recent research that's come from folks who do a lot of deer research in the southeastern U.S., but it also includes data from Kansas and other parts of the Great Plains, has really shown that might not be the exact right way to think about it. So if we're thinking about soil quality driving nutrient availability, then that would say that in more productive parts or areas with more productive soils, then we should see more, let's say, protein, because that's what everybody focuses on with deer, right? Then we should see more protein in species X in this area than we would in a different area. And what that research really showed was that, pokeweed is pokeweed, and it's going to have 30+% protein in it, regardless of where you are and what the soil quality is there. The difference is that in areas with high quality soils, and along with the high quality soils, also enough rainfall to support vegetation growth and all those sorts of things, that we can see higher quantity of the plant. So an ounce of pokeweed is the same regardless of where you are, but in areas that are highly productive, a given acre is going to be able to produce more ounces of pokeweed than someplace with lower productivity.
Sure.
And so soil productivity, rainfall, deer densities, all those sorts of things play into how much food is available.
Do deer normally have enough food? I know in Kansas, food generally is not limiting, correct?
Sure.
What is in the South? Does that still play true?
It can depend. So if the deer densities were appropriate, then a lot of these states, or if deer densities were within the natural carrying capacity,
Sure.
I guess is probably a better way to say that, then a lot of these places would naturally have enough food. Some of the interesting things to think about are like South Texas, where the deer biologists talk a lot about environmental stochasticity, which is a fancy thing to say. But basically what that translates to is because rainfall is not very predictable, and one year you might have a whole bunch of rain, and then for 5 years you might be in a drought and not have very much rain, then supplemental feeding, whether that's feeders or whether that's food plots and those sorts of things, can drastically impact carrying capacity in those areas, because it offsets that unpredictability of rainfall that's driving how much food is naturally available to those critters.
So I'm going to steer us back a little bit towards the food plots themselves, or hunting plots, whatever term we end up with. When I'm thinking about planning them, normally I'm way too late. It's kind of here's hunting season already and I want to throw something out. And so then I'm viewing it kind of as, maybe we've had a frost and I feel like I'm just kind of putting some candy out there and attracting, deer to something that they're excited to eat. And so is that what I'm doing if I'm throwing out some peas or beets or something? And then the other way I think about it is, earlier in the season, maybe I can put out some stuff that, and I'm probably wrong here, but I'm going to supplement them. They're going to go eat this stuff and they're going to grow really big antlers because they have all of the right nutrition they need. Or I put out a mineral block and now they can, go do, which I don't put out mineral blocks anymore, thanks to you. But when I used to, I was thinking, I'm doing all these little things to get the perfect hunting opportunity and help out the deer. Now I'm wondering if I'm just wasting my time, just go climbing that deer stand a little more often.
Right.
That's a lot of information. I don't know if I have a question, but those are some of my thoughts about why I put out plants. Plus, it's just fun to see green when everything else is dead after that frost.
Yeah. Well, so let's think about all the different things that you said, and what we've basically been talking about up to this point is, are food plots necessary?
Yeah.
And so when you're thinking about the effects on antler size and all those sorts of things, really what we need to think about there is, do we see signs in our deer population in an area of food limitation? And typically the things that we would see that would be signs of food limitation would be stuff like winter kill. Do we have massive die-offs when it gets really cold and food becomes limiting? We don't see that in the Central Great Plains at all. Fawn survival, do we see low fawn survival? Fawn survival tends to not be related back to milk production or those sorts of things, available food for fawns that have weaned. It tends to be more associated with cover being limited where we are. Twinning rates, as long as we have some decent rainfall, we see lots and lots of twins. We see triplets sometimes and those sorts of things. And that's independent of anything that somebody's planting. Do we see poor adult body condition and those sorts of things? Well, I don't know how many deer you've harvested during January, but those, that time of year in Kansas and most of the Central Great Plains, we're going to be harvesting does, right? And those does have been pregnant for a couple of months, or at least a month and a half probably during that January time period. And I regularly harvest does that have an inch of fat on their rump, right?
That's crazy.
I don't know that except in very specific situations, I'm not seeing lots of skinny deer out there in this part of the country. When we did our deer research project out in western Kansas, we were catching them in February, March, that time frame, and they're still very, very fat, very healthy deer. So those are signs that point towards we don't have a food limitation issue for the most part. Something else that you could look at on a property, do we see browse lines and those sorts of things? In parts of eastern Kansas and the eastern Great Plains where we have those higher deer densities, you can see some browse lines. Along with those browse lines, though, we should be looking at which specific plants are.
What is a browse line?
That's an important thing to know. Okay, so if you were to look at and in eastern Kansas, you can see this a lot. In the eastern Great Plains, you can see this a lot. If you look at the edge of a crop field, that's a good spot to see this. At the edge of a crop field where the tree line starts, a nice patch of woods next to crops, do all of the branches that have leaves on them on the trees start at a very specific height? Like you can look out there and it just looks like, okay, we only have branches on trees with leaves at 5.5 feet. Okay, that's a sign that the deer are eating all the browse from those trees below that point and pretty much everything that they can reach. But along with that, do we also see that the deer are eating, they're browsing on plants that would be considered low quality vegetation from a nutritional standpoint or from a digestibility standpoint and that sort of thing. So the tools that we have for habitat evaluation for white-tailed deer, they're called WAGs, right? Wildlife Habitat Assessment Guides or Evaluation Guides. One of the categories that we often see in there when it's looking at food limitation is, do we have high use of high choice plants? Do we have high use of medium choice plants or medium quality plants, or do we have high use of low quality plants? If you have high use of low quality plants, that pretty much means that the deer have eaten all the good stuff, right? They've eaten all the medium stuff. And so now they're out there eating the tops out of Sericea lespedeza that's mature and not something that they would normally eat, and other plants like that. And so that's pointing to food limitation. Really, the only time I see those signs in Kansas are where the areas where we have really high deer densities during extreme drought years. And so that's where we see that food limitation. All this started because you were talking about growing antlers on bucks.
Yeah.
Right? So the single most important factor in determining antler size in a buck is not food. What do you suppose it is?
Well, genetics, I would guess.
Okay. So genetics is an important driver of this, but the single most important factor is age.
Oh, well, yeah, duh. That
Right?
makes sense here.
So it doesn't matter how much food a buck has available to him. It doesn't matter what his genetics are. He will never reach the potential that he has to produce antlers unless he becomes mature.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about letting them get to be 5 years of age and older.
And that means we have to let them walk when they're 3 or 4 years and still a pretty buck.
Yeah. So that emphasis of harvest needs to be on antlerless deer and older age bucks. Now, the idea of culling bucks and all that sort of thing, that's there. I would encourage people who want to think about that to look up some episodes on culling bucks from the Deer University podcast, because those folks are going to cover it in way better detail than we can.
Sure.
And that is information that applies everywhere. So if we're thinking about growing big antlers in bucks, and I've got all kinds of good charts and things that I use in our extension programs about this stuff, but protein, that's an important nutrient for growing antlers. Phosphorus is a really important nutrient for growing antlers. Calcium is a really important nutrient for growing antlers. Those things are not limited in the natural food that is available in the Great Plains during that summer time period that's important for antler growth for deer. They are out there selecting the plants that have those nutrients in them that they need, and those plants are really abundant on the landscape. Our forbs that are naturally available, the broadleaf herbaceous plants, that stuff's very abundant in those plants. And then that's not even thinking about the agricultural plants that are out there in most of those places. And so when we add those agricultural plants into it, and look at the plants that deer are eating from diet studies from the Great Plains at that time of the year, they're not limited on those nutrients that drive antler growth and milk production in does and all those sorts of things. So the characteristics during the warm season that are important. That is also supported by research even from places like South Texas, where they have supplied protein feed to deer on a very large scale on the landscape. It's very hard to increase the average antler size of bucks by providing food or supplementation. So those warm season food plots really aren't something that needs to be a focus for whitetail deer hunters in at least our part of the Great Plains. And one of the things to think about there is, it's very easy to fall into marketing. And so, yes, folks can provide products that have protein in them, have phosphorus, have lots of different vitamins and those sorts of things that may or may not be important. But those products are only going to be beneficial to your deer from an antler production standpoint if the things in them are limiting on the landscape.
Sure.
And there's not a lot of evidence that they are.
So I think that, you've done a really good job of explaining why you would call it a hunting plot, or, they have plenty of food out there, right? But when I'm planting, I like to plant peas because I'm lazy. So I'm, just scatter out some peas and watch them grow. And I watch deer walk along, and they hammer them. They like to eat them.
Sure.
So if they have enough food, why are they eating the peas that I throw out there?
Well, and that goes back to the fact that, like what you were saying before, is you're providing some candy, right? So that the purpose of that food plot in this part of the country is to get a critter in front of somebody at a specific time, right? And it's to make the movements of that critter more predictable. And let's just think about K-State's campus. If you wanted to have a high probability of encountering folks, there's some different places that you could go. And one of those places, I use this example in my habitat management class, and it might be kind of a goofy example, but we have folks who want to encounter lots of people to hand out pamphlets, or hand out other things. And those folks gather in certain areas. One of those places is crosswalks, right? Another place is by the student union. And other places might be where a public transportation bus stops. Okay, if we're thinking about deer, or translating those kinds of things back to wildlife, a crosswalk represents a bottleneck, right? So that would be a place on the landscape where critters have to go, or critters might make the choice to go to make their movements more easy. An example of a bottleneck out on the landscape might be a small patch of trees between or in the middle of, let's say we've got a small patch of trees that's providing cover that is in between a bedding and a feeding area. Okay, so that's your crosswalk. That's your bottleneck. The drop-off point for public transportation would be the same sort of thing. What's the student union represent?
Well, that's food, I would guess.
Yeah, that's food. It's also a gathering place, but it's there's lots and lots of eating places there. So having that food in a specific location makes it more likely that you're going to encounter that critter.
Sure.
So that's an important piece of it. Why are they eating it if they've got enough food? That goes back to providing something that they might like because of either the nutritional characteristics that it has, the protein content, the phosphorus content, the energy content, all those different things. So that's one reason they might eat it. It also might be that it is a kind of food that tends to be limited at a given time of the year. So you're talking about peas. Well, in our area, if you scatter out Austrian winter peas during the fall and they start to grow, that is a legume that I like to eat myself. I like to go out and when I plant Austrian winter peas, I'll go out there and pick some and eat them just like greens or a salad, right? Because they're sweet. They've got a lot of energy in them. They've also got a lot of protein. They're highly digestible. They're tasty. They're palatable. All those sorts of things. And during that fall hunting season time, many of our forbs, including lots of our native legumes, have senesced or they've stopped growing. They've turned brown. Their nutritional quality has drastically declined. Their digestibility has declined. They've become tough and all those sorts of things. So if you can provide something that's tasty and nutritious and easy to digest that is not necessarily available, even though protein may not be limited at that time of the year, then they're going to eat it. So Call Hall, it's closed right now, so we can't go there right now at K-State campus. But that's where our ice cream is produced, right? And so when we think about those food plot plants, and why are the deer selecting them? Well, they're selecting them for the same reason that you might select a Call Hall ice cream cone, right? It's tasty. It's got a lot of energy in it. It produces signals in your body that say, this is good.
Yeah.
And it's good because it's sweet. It's good for lots of different reasons. But that doesn't, you're probably not ice cream limited, are you?
My kids might be, but I don't think that I am.
Yeah. And I think the point I'm trying to make there is just because an animal eats something and just because they select something when it's available doesn't necessarily mean that they're limited.
Yeah, we don't need to have the ice cream, but if it's in front of me, I'm going to eat it kind of deal.
Sure.
That makes sense. I love winter peas. I think, in conversations with you, it's been something for me. I just go out with a leaf blower and I blow off the leaves and I lightly scratch it up with a rake. It's something that I can do with my little boys in an afternoon. And generally it's later in the season because even though I have good intentions, I get busy or lazy, depending on which word you want to use. And it gets late and then it's time to plant something. And so I go out and I like to throw them out. But, I often think to myself, maybe I should be going to the local farm store and buying a seed package that has a bunch of different seeds in it that I assume these people have put a lot of effort and energy into developing the perfect or what they consider the perfect combination. So do you have ideas? I mean, what should I be planting? Are the peas a good idea, or should I be buying something formulated for these deer? Sure.
So when you're thinking about what to plant, there's lots of different things that you want to think about. You alluded to timing. That's an important thing. If you're getting out there, we're getting out there and getting ready, let's say in August, rather than October, like we're talking right now, then the plants that you might plant at that time of the year are going to be probably different than what you might plant in October. So also other things to consider is how long do you need that to be available? If you're an early season archery hunter and you need food to be out there during September and early October, but you don't really care about the rest of the year, then what you plant is probably going to be very, very different than somebody who's getting out there late. How much forage do you need to produce? What's available in the surrounding landscape is another important thing to think about. In the Great Plains, we've got so much agriculture. You may have wheat all around you. And wheat is a fantastic food plot plant to attract deer to a spot for, really the duration of the season when you might be able to harvest a deer from September all the way through middle of January in Kansas. And so that's a good plant. But if the entire landscape around where you hunt is a food plot of winter wheat, then you might want to plant something else. So that's something to consider. What's your soil quality like? Or what are your soil characteristics? Is it acidic? Is it basic? So that's the pH, right? What sort of nutrient limitation do you have in that soil? Is it wet? Is it super dry? All those things are important things to think about. We also see that those soil characteristics, the nutritional characteristics of the soil, can affect what deer select in specific areas. So, a good example of that we see is sometimes within the same county, I will have people tell me that, I plant turnips every year and the deer won't touch my turnips. It doesn't matter if it's the early part of the season or the late part of the season when they're supposed to be digging up those bulbs or tubers, whichever they're called, and eat them. They won't eat them. But a friend of mine that lives 5 miles away, the deer just hammer the turnips. They eat the tops out of them when they're green, and then they dig up the turnip part that we would eat and all that kind of stuff. Well, what you're seeing there is that because turnips are brassicas, they accumulate sulfur from the soil. And so if you're in an area with low pH, has high sulfur in the soil, then the deer might already have so much sulfur in their diet from the natural plants that they're avoiding those turnips. It's not that a different variety of turnip would do you better. It's not that it's something that you're doing. It's the deer selecting the nutrients that they need and avoiding things that they might be already overloaded on in an area. So because of that, I usually don't recommend turnips to people who are just asking me for some basic recommendations. Something else to think about: do you want an annual or a perennial? Annuals tend to be easier to take care of. They can be more intensive because we're planting something every year. But perennials, a lot of times folks overlook the fact that you're going to have weed management to do next year. You might plant alfalfa, and year 2 you have a great stand of alfalfa. Year 1 you're probably not going to have a great stand of alfalfa, but year 2 you've got a great stand of alfalfa, and then all of a sudden you got nothing but weeds next year. And so there's benefits and drawbacks to both annuals or perennials, but it's going to depend on how good of a farmer you are and how much time you have to put into that effort of maintaining that. So that's something important to think about. What was your initial question? I've gotten a little far into the weeds.
Well, you know
here.
what I think what I was trying to get at is a lot of times the co-op is easy for me to get to, and
that's
so
right.
I go buy peas. I've thrown out oats just kind of for fun, but I'm wondering if the products that they make that are formulated with the variety, would that be better than what I'm throwing out there?
So one of the things to think about is that the mixes that we see sometimes that are formulated for deer and those sorts of things, they might have a pea in them, and they might have a clover in them, and they might have wheat in them, and they might have rye in them, and all those sorts of things. Small seeds are intended to be planted like a 1/4 inch depth or less. Large seeds are supposed to be planted like an inch deep. Okay, so if you take everything that's all mixed up in that bag and you go out and plant it, then part of your stuff's going to be too shallow and part of it's going to be too deep. An important consideration when you're looking at those mixes is that they're basically designed so that anybody can go throw it out somewhere and something will grow.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily designed so that everything in there is going to grow every time that you put it out. So there's challenges associated with it. The important thing to remember is that if you buy certified seed, then that is going to, on the label, it's going to tell you how much weed seed is in there. It's going to tell you pure live seed versus hard seed, and all those different things. And so you can do a good job of planting the appropriate rate, and making sure you're not putting invasive species out there and all those sorts of things. And the types of mixes that you're talking about generally are certified seed, and so that's a good characteristic that they have. They're also going to be mixes of plants that at least something in there is going to grow in most conditions, and they all tend to be things that deer will select. You can also spend a lot less money typically and go buy the specific things that you want to plant as individual bags of seed from a seed company. And that tends to be a more cost-effective way to go about things. Most general recommendations about providing food to whitetail deer suggest that if you're trying to do the best that you can, that you're going to provide a lot of variety. You're going to have some cereal grains like winter wheat or oats. You're going to have legumes like alfalfa or clover or Austrian peas. You might have some brassicas in the mix. The thing to think about is you might do better to plant specific areas in those different things rather than trying to plant mixes that include them, because your germination success and those sorts of things are probably not going to do as well if you try to plant them all together.
Sure.
the way that you can get around that is, let's say you mentioned oats and winter peas. That's a combination that I recommend to a lot of people because it's super easy.
Yep.
I've never seen a place in Kansas where the deer didn't really select those two
they
things.
love 'em.
Yeah. And there tends to not be a lot of either one of those things on the landscape.
Sure.
So what you can do is either with a drill or through broadcasting, you can plant the oats, and then you can broadcast the winter peas on top of them, and you can have a mixed plot of oats and winter peas. The deer like both of those things, and they provide different stuff to them. And you're not planting either one of them at the wrong depth and that sort of thing.
Sure.
The other cool thing about oats or not oats, sorry, but winter peas that you mentioned is we can do some non-conventional things with them. And I kind of stumbled across this because I was filling a drill when I was doing some food plot trials, and I spilled a bunch of winter peas when I was filling that drill. And I came back a couple weeks later, I noticed that in the fescue border, tall fescue, really thick stuff, right?
Yeah.
That fescue border that was around the food plot area where I'd spilled all these peas, they were growing up through the fescue. And so I kind of started fooling around with just broadcasting those peas or scattering them by hand, either way, into that fescue, and trying to do that because tall fescue is great cattle forage, but for a browser like deer, it doesn't provide really any food value. And there's a lot of areas in Kansas where we have a lot of tall fescue. So if we can utilize those areas for something from a wildlife standpoint, that might be good. So I started fooling around with broadcasting the peas into fescue that had been mowed, after it was mowed, and right before rain. And what I saw was it doesn't really matter where you broadcast those peas, as long as they've got a little bit of soil contact and as long as they've got some sort of cover. It doesn't have to be a lot of cover. They're going to germinate if they've got moisture. And they will grow up, and regardless of where you put them, the deer are going to hammer them. In that fescue situation, if deer densities are very high, they will basically keep them cropped down to the height of the fescue. At your place, one of the things that you mentioned trying was just taking a leaf blower or a rake, blowing down to that soil, and then scattering those peas out before rain and letting them germinate that way.
Yeah.
And that's a really cool way to get a small food plot in the woods. You don't have to have any tillage equipment. You don't have to do much from a maintenance standpoint or a preparation standpoint, and you can attract deer to a spot that's in front of a deer stand or a photography blind or whatever you're wanting to do. So that, I think it's important to remember that it's easy to get caught up in thinking that we have to do things the way that they're advertised or the way that we see people doing them on hunting shows and those sorts of things. And it's actually pretty easy to get a small hunting plot that utilizes space in a different way than we might normally do, and still achieve that goal of providing some kind of forage out there that's going to attract deer to a place where we can see them or harvest them.
Yeah, I think it's been really fun to go out, and it doesn't take that long to clean off the leaf litter and throw out some peas. So it's often fun. One of the big things I think I took away a lot from this, but I tend to think about the packaging material. I'm looking at the front and which one has a bigger deer or something like that. And really, if you are going to buy a mix, maybe you ought to look at the back and see, like you mentioned, what seeds are in there and what weeds are in there and stuff like that. So a lot of times the marketing gets a hold of us, but I think just getting out there and playing and having fun is the important thing.
Yeah, definitely. And we all fall prey to marketing, and I mean that's just part of business, right? But I think when we're thinking about wildlife management, one of the really important things that we should always think about is, when we're making a decision about something like that, is what are they trying to sell me? And that picture of a buck on a bag and those sorts of things, that it stimulates that response of, if I buy that package, it's got the better picture on it. Well, then maybe that's what I'm going to get, but that's not always the case.
Sure. Well, Drew, that was a lot of good and fun information. I really enjoyed that conversation. Thanks for sharing all that knowledge. So another good episode, and appreciate y'all listening to us, and we'll be back in a couple weeks with another aquatics episode.
Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.